a U.S. senator destroyed by blackmail.
He was not bound by the truth or by facts.
The country's most outrageous political demagogue, ascending toward the peak of American power.
Millions upon millions of devoted followers.
This is a story of heroes willing to face down tyranny and the risk to the country if they fail.
Rachel Maddow presents Ultra, Season 2 of the chart-topping original podcast. Listen now.
Hello and welcome to Immigrantly. I am Sadia Khan. Our today's guest is Lazou. She wears many hats and holds different identities as a Sino-Mauritian-Canadian-American producer, writer, singer, and artist. She grew up in Mauritius, was born in Canada, by the way, and after an almost 10-year career in technology as a software engineer and data scientist in Silicon Valley, she switched to music and media. You'll be surprised to know she still uses her data science and engineering skills into data management and production for her podcasts. Lazou's songwriting showcases her trilingual abilities with songs written in English, French, and Mauritian Creole. It was fun to talk to somebody who can speak multiple languages and who comes from a collectivist society and hence understands the nuances. Talking about the nuances, she is the creator and host of the Nuances podcast.
Welcome to Nuances, Beyond First Impressions with the Asian Diaspora,
which features discussions about the Asian diaspora, immigrant experiences, intersectionality of identities, LGBTQ plus rights, anti-racism, feminism, politics, religion, career choices, family dynamics, and so much more. I kid you not, Lazou and I had an hour-long conversation, and I felt there was so much more that we could talk about. And I even told Lazou that maybe we should have a second episode where we can delve into some other interesting conversations. I hope you enjoy this episode. So without further ado, let's get started. Hi, Lazou. Welcome to Immigrantly.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll start with your name. This is not your birth name, right?
No.
But it's a beautiful name. And I am wondering, how did you decide to choose this as your stage name?
So my actual name is very long, and it's also a name that sounds like a country singer from Nashville. And I do not look like one. And as a musician, I found that it was very confusing to people. So my name is actually Sherry-Lynn. And when I would tell that to people, they would look at my face and then they would try to think of what kind of Asian name that is. And they would never spell it right. They could never remember it. And I just found it very frustrating to try and explain my name every single time. And this only happens in the US.
I'm pretty sure.
So I just decided, okay, I need a name that is shorter, first of all, and that might be less confusing in terms of what I look like and what the name looks like on paper, right? So Lazou is actually a Mauritian Creole word meaning cheek, because when I was a kid, I had big cheeks. I still do. And my friends would call me Lazou.
Oh, nice.
So I thought, this is short and it doesn't sound like a particular ethnic group. So maybe this will be less confusing. But then I didn't realize that. So I'm of Chinese descent, but I don't speak Chinese. And people look at Lazou and they see my Chinese face and they try to pronounce it in a Chinese way. And I was like, oh, I didn't think about that.
So you are a musician. You're a producer, a podcaster, a data scientist. What is that you haven't done, Lazou? There is so much that you've done. But is there a particular creative space that you subscribe to more than others?
Music was always my first love. So that is something that I always go back to. You know, I might take some breaks, like, you know, if I'm working on the podcast, like I'm working on this limited series and it's taking up all my time, I'm doing a lot less music. But then whenever I have a bit of time, that's what I like to go back to. So music definitely is my first love. But I found in general that creativity is my thing. Like I just love trying new things. I love making new things. I love trying new art forms that I have no business trying, but I will do it anyway. I've done some woodworking. I've done some welding. Yeah, I think being creative and trying new mediums, learning new stuff that you probably won't go and make a career out of it, but I think it's really good to try them and find out how you enjoy them. I love making furniture. I'm terrible at it, but it's fun.
What do you like about making furniture?
Especially now when we're always in front of screens and on our phones. I think it's really nice to disconnect from that. Like if you're making furniture, your hands are dirty, you're maybe wearing a mask, you know, wearing goggles and whatnot. If it's a sanding day, you're just working with your hands and your eyes. You have a design in mind. You're trying to get the angles right. You're trying to cut things right. Doesn't always happen. You have to focus. And I think it's a good way to feel grounded and feel, I don't know, I find it very meditative to just make furniture or paint or anything that's occupying your hands and also keeping you away from screens. I find very relaxing.
That makes so much sense. We're all on our screens, looking at our phones all the time. It's almost as if we have forgotten how to engage with the outside world, outside our phones. So it's important to do something like what you're doing, right? Lazou, let's go back to your childhood. Tell me, where did you grow up? What was your childhood like?
So I was born in Canada, and then my parents moved back to Mauritius, which is where they grew up. Mauritius is a tiny island east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. It's the only place the dodo bird ever lived. So I grew up there. It was big families on both sides, all very close. It's a tiny island. We see each other all the time. And two of my dad's brothers had houses in the same yard. So I had cousins around growing up. And it was very different from life in America. And I still am adjusting to the fact that, you know, I grew up in a place where I was the minority as a light-skinned person. Most of the Mauritians are descendants of Africans or South Asians. Chinese people are about 2% of the population. There's barely any white people, like less than 1%. So it was very different. There's a lot of religions that are practiced. Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Catholics, you know, Anglicans, we all get along. I feel like in the US, there is the main one and then there's everybody else. It was not like that growing up.
Going back to what you said about growing up with extended family, having those strong familial bonds, what did they teach you? How did they influence you in becoming who you are today?
I think it taught me that you have to be flexible. And I'm reminded of that every time I go home because we might have a plan. Let's say we decided we're going for a picnic today. So I'm going to wake up thinking we're going to go for a picnic today. And then I'll wake up and my dad will be like, well, before we go to the picnic, we got to pick this thing up from that friend. And then we got to go, this other friend needs this thing from me. So we're going to go drop that off. And then we're going to go to the picnic. So we have to leave 2 hours earlier than you thought we were going to leave because we have to do all these things. And it's always like this, right? Like there's always something that's coming up. Everybody's always pitching in to help each other out. Everybody's life is so interconnected. Whereas I think here, we're very much individualist and we're in our own little bubble. But really being so intertwined with other people in your daily life, it really forces you to learn that it's not always about you and it's not always about what your priorities are. Other people have priorities too, and sometimes you have to roll with it.
Flexibility, that's such an apt term to describe collectivist societies. I grew up in Pakistan and I have similar experiences. And what I don't understand about American culture, where obviously individualism is at the center of everything, is that there is lack of flexibility when it comes to people's time, their relationships, how they view you in relation to how they view themselves, right? And I struggle that a bit with my daughters who were born and raised here. And we always have these arguments back and forth, what needs to give. And I totally get what you said about collectivist societies are not perfect. There are a lot of flaws and a lot that needs to be improved. But at the same time, that sense of even self-care can manifest in taking care of others is something that I really, truly miss in the US. So I'm glad you mentioned the term flexibility because that perfectly describes how people who grow up in collectivist societies are conditioned to be. Let's take a jarring transition now. You were born in Canada, grew up in Mauritius, but then you end up in the US.
Mm-hmm.
How does that happen?
As a Canadian, I had the advantage of being able to go to school there, university, with the Canadian tuition fee, not the international student fee. So I studied at the University of Toronto. I got a computer science degree. And then after I graduated, I worked at a startup. I was very lucky that the startup got acquired by one of the Silicon Valley giants, and they offered me a job. They paid for our move and everything. So it was a no-brainer. Like, of course I'm going to go. And it's funny because I never really entertained the idea of moving to the US. I had never even thought about it because, I'm already Canadian, close enough. What's the difference? To me, all of the West was the same thing growing up, right? Because I was from this little island in the middle of the ocean. So I never really thought about moving to the US. And embarrassing to admit, but I didn't even know where Silicon Valley was. Like, that's how not interested I was. But then, the offer came and it was an offer you can't refuse. And it's in California. The weather's much nicer than Toronto. So I said, why not? Maybe if I don't like it, I can always go back, right? So I moved to the US, worked there for about almost 5 years. And then I made the switch after that because after moving here, I met my now husband and we were both in tech. And at some point, we were both wanting to do something more creative. He's also a musician.
Oh, I like that.
And after working there for that number of years, because it's Silicon Valley and you get stock options and all of that, you can build a little bit of a nest egg and a backup plan, if you will. And so I had the huge privilege of being able to do that, right? So I planned my exit. We downsized, we sold a bunch of stuff, and we decided, let's do something we love and see where it goes.
But you do use your skills from being a software engineer and a data scientist into podcast production, at least, right? So you do data management and all. And I am curious to know, how do you bring these two different forms together? And do you see any creativity in engineering?
Oh, absolutely. I think in any job, you can have creativity whenever you come up with a solution for something, right? You find something that is inefficient or that isn't working quite right, and you figure out a way to make it better. That's creativity. So absolutely. And I think that was part of the reason why I went into software engineering, because as somebody who grew up on a tiny island, I couldn't just tell my parents who were earning rupees to send me to a music school that, then I might not be able to sustain myself and, and all of that. And I had a brother who also needed to go to college, so I couldn't just burn all the money. So getting the engineering degree, I really enjoyed programming as a kid. I was a nerd too. I always found it really fun to be able to sit at a computer, type some stuff, and then the computer does stuff. It's like creating stuff out of thin air, right? And to me, it's the same as writing a song.
Yeah.
You sit there, you write something. It wasn't there before, now it is.
Right.
And in terms of podcasting, I am a solo podcaster. I don't have a team. So I do everything myself. And up until the last season, for each season, I release every week. So it's a lot of work every week. So I have divided my workflow in a way that minimizes any repetitive work that I need to do. I also figured out a way to batch processes like writing captions for social media posts. Like I do all of that at once. And then I have things where I press a button, it goes to my scheduler, it goes to all the social media platforms. So yeah, I've definitely used my skills to make my process more streamlined than probably the average podcaster.
When the world won't listen and your screams are weakened to whisper.
Let's switch to your music. I have listened to your music on Spotify. I love your voice.
Oh, thank you.
Remember the trouble that stays with status quo. Let's not.
And this is something that, as I was telling you before we started this recording, I've been listening to your podcast and you said something fleeting. It was just a comment that I heard on one of your podcast episodes and it really struck me. I wanted to ask you about this. You said something along the lines, and I'm rephrasing it.
Mm-hmm.
You want to do this experiment where you think if you were to put a blonde white woman as a cover for your album will sell more. And you said it jokingly, but talk to me about that. Why do you think that?
Because it's true. So I think you probably know, especially if you're a girl growing up, there's these beauty standards that you're surrounded by. Even, I'm sure, in Pakistan, right? Like there's this beauty standard, usually lighter skin, usually all the movies that you would see, especially when I was a kid, they were all white people. The lead characters are usually blonde. They're usually blue-eyed. All my Barbies were blue-eyed. And I remember being maybe 4 years old. And my mom was trying to get me to drink milk, and I hated milk. And she said, well, maybe if you drink your milk, you might get blonde hair and blue eyes. And I think I tried it for like one day, and then I was like, it's not worth it.
I wasn't expecting that. When I was growing up in Pakistan, we were told that if you drink milk, you'll get lighter skin.
Oh.
Somehow, milk was this magical potion. If you consumed it, your skin will turn light or lighter. And so everybody was supposed to drink milk and not tea because tea would make you darker. And as I'm saying these things, I'm like, oh my gosh, how fucked up is that?
Yeah.
Well, I thought she would say that if you drank milk, your skin would get lighter. But she went
there
way ahead, right?
And it didn't work. So my mom had me when she was pretty young. She was in her early 20s. And like young women do, looking at magazines and kind of daydreaming about all the pretty stuff that you see in magazines. And I remember she made a very fleeting comment about white women are so pretty. We'll never be this pretty. And I'm a kid. I don't really know anything. And she's really young. She's not really thinking about how that affects a child, right? And I do remember that I was really sad for her and for me. And I think growing up, I did notice that even though I didn't want to, I also agreed with that comment because everything you see that is beautiful in the magazines, that's on the TV, that, everywhere, it's always the same beauty standard.
Oh my gosh, Lazou, I am so glad we are having this conversation because what you just said, you did not agree with your mom, but then you internalized it as well. We all do. We can criticize it. We can joke about it. But somewhere in our brains and in our minds, we are conditioned to believe in the same ideas of beauty that our parents or their parents passed on. How do we change that?
It depends on the generation, right? I think for the kids who are being born now by parents who are more aware of the fact that Eurocentric beauty is not a great thing and we have other options, right? But for those of us who grew up in that environment where it's already in your brain, right? Your brain's already wired this way. It's really hard to unlearn that. What has worked for me is not body positivity, but body neutrality.
What does that mean?
Body positivity is telling yourself, I'm beautiful, I love myself. And I think that's jumping ahead. I think you have to get first to the point, at least for me, where you don't care. It's like, I have a body, it works. It doesn't need to be pretty to be worth anything. It does the job. I don't need to be pretty.
But who defines what pretty is? Because when you say it's not pretty, are you not subscribing to those same standards that your mom subscribed to or still subscribes to? Because then you've already accepted that you're not pretty, but by what standard?
Yes and no. I think our society we're encouraged to care what we look like. And what I'm saying is, what I look like doesn't matter. I could be pretty, I could be ugly. I don't care because my worth is not tied to what I look like. My worth as a human is tied to how I treat other people, what I'm contributing to this world, the kind of work that I'm doing, the kind of friend that I am, the kind of daughter that I am. What I look like is such a small part of who I am. And it's a part that will continue to change.
Yeah.
So why am I spending so much time caring about this and, trying to obsess about either loving it or improving it or, fixing it? Why care? It's just a body. And I think also I've had a bunch of health issues over my lifetime. And I think that has also helped me appreciate the fact that I have a body that is relatively healthy right now. And is it the way that I would see it in a magazine? No. Does that really matter in the end? Also, no.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily subscribing to the standard. It's saying, I don't care. Why is there even a standard?
And it manifests for you differently, right? Because I saw one of your Instagram posts where you talk about your gray hair. And you say that, there's no need to dye your hair. And you tie it to capitalism. But when I was reading that post, I also thought to myself, more than capitalism, it's ageism and it's patriarchy and it's misogyny. It's how women are conditioned to think that their power lies in how beautiful they are and how dark or blonde their hair are, but not gray, and how their skin should be taut. It's less about capitalism. Yes, capitalism probably benefits from it. It leverages those insecurities, but capitalism is not at the center of how women have been made to feel for centuries.
It's just a tool.
It is a tool, right?
Of the patriarchy.
And not just women. On your podcast, the series that you're doing, you've talked about ageism within gay community, right? So it's just so fascinating. If all of us were to just pause and really intentionally think about all those different stereotypes and conditioning that's been done to us, there is so much to unlearn.
Yeah.
And yet it's so difficult to do at the same time.
Even last week, I got a text from my grandma. She texts me all the time. And she's about 80 now. And she struggles with her looks because she used to be one of the pretty girls when she was younger. All the boys were after her. And, now she looks in the mirror and she doesn't see that person anymore. And she struggles with it. And I really struggle to find the words to console her because how do you explain to someone her age that it doesn't matter what you look like? That's not what determines your worth. But she's spent 80 years thinking that that's what matters.
Mostly through male gaze though, right? So for her, it's how, as you said, how boys used to look at her. It's also for women especially, it's how other people perceive them. The validation that they get mostly comes from others, less so from themselves.
Yeah.
And you're trying to decenter that, right? Not just validation, as you said. It's like, let's not just care about it at all.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a small part of who we are at the end of the day, right? I mean, if you think about anybody you care about in your life, would you treat them any differently if they didn't look the way they do? No. So why are we making it such a big deal about ourselves when we don't think it's a really big deal about anybody else? Why are we putting ourselves on a different standard when, honestly, I do not care what people I love look like?
You're right. Nobody does.
Yeah.
We don't think about how our loved ones look like. Nobody does that.
Yeah.
Lazou, let's talk about your podcast because we've been referencing your podcast throughout this conversation.
Yeah.
I've been listening to it. It's well made.
Thank you.
As a podcaster, I was thinking about the production quality.
Thank you so much. That means a lot.
The podcast is called Nuances, and it's aptly called that, right? Because you are talking about subtleties of culture and identity. I wonder, how do you strike this balance between celebrating cultural uniqueness and also promoting cultural assimilation in some ways? Because there is a fine line between the two.
For me, it really depends on the guest. I'm never trying to push them in a particular direction. I think it's really helpful for us to showcase different cultures within the Asian community, because a lot of the times when you say Asian, people think of somebody who looks like me, right? And I'm very aware that in the US, there's so many other types of Asian.
I am Asian.
Right? So to me, it was important to start bringing those other stories and encourage people who look like me to also say, hey, Asian means more than just us. Asian also means Pakistani, also means Lao, Hmong, Filipino. So I think it's nice to see the differences in terms of cultures because it reinforces the fact that we're not a monolith, that our experiences are different. And it really goes against the stereotypes that we have about Asians. You know, the stereotype is that Asians are the model minority, that we're successful and relatively well off. But if you break it down to the different ethnic groups and based on what generation they've been in the country, it's very different.
Yeah.
Right? There's definitely some pockets of the Asian diaspora that are much richer. And then there's definitely pockets that are much poorer. There's undocumented Asian immigrants, right? There's all these different experiences. And then there's people who have mixed backgrounds and their experience is very different. So the differences is important to reinforce the fact that we're not a monolith. But then while also showing those differences, when people tell their stories, inevitably you find that there's common ground. You can always relate to at least part of the story. And I think that's the other side of it, where, yes, our experiences might be different, but all immigrants have certain things that they go through and their families go through. And even if you're not an immigrant, there's struggles that you probably also have. Even if you're a white person, there's probably some experiences that you've gone through that might be slightly relatable to you. And I think by having people tell their stories in the most authentic way I can get them to do so on the podcast, it helps make those connections, both contrasting against the stereotypes, but also humanizing, because that's what humanizing means. Finding stories that you can empathize with or that you have compassion for, that maybe you relate to or don't relate to, but you think, oh, wow, I never thought about that, but I can see how that would be a struggle for somebody. And maybe next time I see that, I have more compassion for somebody like this.
Now, you've interviewed a lot of guests, but if you could have this one dream guest from any period or cultural background on your podcast, who would you invite?
Ooh, any period.
And you're telling stories from, a particular period in your series, which are so fascinating. I was listening to one and I was like, oh my gosh, I was blown away. But yeah, going back to the question.
Okay. So at this moment in time, because of the series that I'm working on, this has been on my mind. If I had to interview somebody, it would be this poet from the Qing dynasty named Wu Cao. She was one of the most famous lyricists of all time. She was very prolific and probably queer, but there's no certain evidence. But in the upcoming episode, we'll share a poem that she wrote that's like, that's pretty sure she was. So she's a very fascinating character because her father was a merchant. Her husband was a merchant. We don't know anything about her mom. We don't know how she learned to read, write, paint, write music, play music.
Wow.
She did all these things. And she just sounds like she was such an icon of her time. She just did her own thing. She would sometimes dress in a more masculine way. And at the time, that was probably very different. I have a lot of questions, so I would love to interview her.
I was going to ask you, what is one question that you would absolutely ask her? Like one question that you're like, oh my gosh, if I could, this is the question I would ask her.
What is it that you wanted to write about that you couldn't?
Oh, wow.
Because I think in a lot of the poetry that she writes and a lot of the lyrics, I feel like there's a lot you could read between the lines. And of course, you can never know exactly what those things were. And at the time, women were starting to become educated. There were increasing number of women who were writing poetry and all of that. But it was still a very patriarchal, male-dominated field. And I'm guessing that she would have had to play by the rules of the time if she wanted to keep being active in the industry, whether that's as a lyricist, as a playwright, all of that. If she wanted commissions from people, you got to play the game. So I would ask her, if you didn't have to play the game, what would you have written?
So if I were to turn this question around and ask you, what is that you would like to explore through your music or podcast that you haven't yet?
For the podcast, I definitely want to have more guests from lesser known Asian ethnic groups and regions. I would love to have Central Asians, more Southeast Asians. You probably have this too, but I have a list of potential guests.
I do.
I've been crossing out people as I book them. I have a long list. So for the podcast, it's easy. I have a long list of people that I've already I would love to interview those people, but it just hasn't worked out yet. And I keep finding more.
That's a good thing. It is another episode for the podcast.
Yeah.
But for your lyrics, for your music.
Definitely the work that I've been doing on the podcast has made me want to explore more of my identity and my experiences with that. For some reason, I found it a lot harder to write about that. I think it needs to stew a little bit more before it comes out.
Has there been a guest on your podcast whose perspective changed your understanding of a particular cultural nuance or cultural practice?
Oh, so many.
But one that stands out.
Definitely the episode that I did with Edmund really shocked me because I did not know how much anti-Asian sentiment there was in the gay community. That was a huge shock to me.
Lazou, can you elaborate a little on that just for our listeners? You're doing a series on queerness.
Right.
And you're doing different episodes with your friend, Edmund.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I interviewed Edmund in the first season of the podcast where I just had him as a guest and he came in and shared his story. So he's a historical violinist and he's also gay. And he was telling us how in the gay community, when he joined things like gay.com in the 90s, on a lot of the profiles out there, he would see no fats, no femmes, no Asians. And that just shocked me that there would be something so overt on a dating profile is absolutely mind-blowing to me. And after I talked to him, I started researching for this series and I saw other people sharing their story and saying the same thing. And even today, they might not have it on their profile bio, but they still will say to people, I'm not into Asians. In the recent episode I did the historical episode, we talked about some stories from pre-modern Asia. And I had Edmund come back as a guest co-host to talk about those stories. And he also shared that when he goes to a gay bar, for example, a couple of times, and he just goes and says hi to somebody, and the first thing out of their mouth is not hello. The first thing out of their mouth is, I'm not into Asians.
Yeah.
It's like, you could just say hello. Like, so that was very, very shocking to me. I just had never encountered anti-Asian sentiments so overt. And the fact that this is common in the gay community and that I had no idea that this was happening to my own community was shocking to me. And it was like, it really made me realize that I need to learn more about the queer community. I need to learn more about the perspectives of even people in my own community that I just don't know because their experience is so different from mine. It's the same with my episode with Cece. I don't know if you've listened to that one, but same thing. You know, there's so much that I don't know about the trans experience that my guests have helped me understand.
So you're absolutely right. I was listening to this episode and I was shocked. And not just shocked because of what your friend was saying about how he's treated, but also how he looks at, say, Pride Month. And for us, you know, we look at events and incidents a certain way because we don't have the knowledge or the understanding of a different community, different from ours, right? And that's why I feel like this episode is so important, not just because of the historical context that you give and what was happening in history and how queerness was defined at the time, or not defined at all. It wasn't, in fact, defined at all. And how people are boxed now, and there is a name for every identity, and how that can be problematic. And you're right. I mean, as a listener, when I was listening to it, I was shocked too. But why did you decide to do this series on queerness? How did that come about?
So it was partly inspired by Edmund, but also other guests that I've had. About 25% of my guests have been queer. And every time I interview somebody from the queer community, I learn something new. And I've also learned a lot about the struggles that they've had. And it always is something that I never thought about, right?
Right.
So at the same time, they're struggling to fit in the queer community because the queer community is very centered on whiteness. And then at the same time, in their own families, there's also often tension because queerness is a bit taboo. There's like a whole spectrum of acceptance when it comes to queerness. I think that's true of white households as well, like all households. But I think in a lot of Asian contexts, because of our immigrant backgrounds and our family's desire to preserve the culture, there's also a tendency to be a little more conservative because of that. And because there was never really any talk about queerness in our cultures, I feel like that can lead to conflating the fact that we don't know about queerness to, it's not part of our culture. And I feel like having a series like this would be a good entry point to have a conversation about it.
And Lazou, in your series, you also mention how this conservative, more regimented, one-dimensional idea of queerness comes through imperialism and colonialism. It did not exist in Eastern societies because this whole idea of whether you are or you aren't queer wasn't as simple. That to me was so fascinating, which is true as well.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times in Western societies, we see people judging Eastern societies for how closed and conservative they are. But some of it, in fact, at least in this space, is a product of imperialism and colonialism.
Yeah. So I will have a whole episode dedicated to this topic. So for the listeners, a general overview is that before contact with the West, a lot of Eastern societies, I'm not going to say all because I didn't look at all the countries, but the ones that I've looked at, a lot of them, they had queerness or what we consider queerness today. It wasn't always a man with a woman. Sometimes it was a man with a man sometimes. So they didn't have labels for things. Things were happening We're not really sure about the women because there's not a lot of information about women. That's the upcoming episode. Go listen to it. But at least for men, we know that there was a lot of queerness happening and it was totally okay in most of the places. It was happening at the highest level. The emperors had male lovers. Nobody batted an eye.
But they didn't see themselves as queer, though.
No. So in a lot of those cases, they didn't see themselves as queer. And it mattered who was the penetrator and who was the penetratee. So the penetrator was seen as a normal heterosexual man. The other man was seen as potentially, not always, but sometimes was seen as like a stand-in for a woman.
Oh.
Not always. So there's a whole other layer there, which will be in yet another episode.
How many episodes are you doing on this topic?
I have 9 planned out.
The fascinating thing for me is that you're taking a historical perspective on it, because history is so interesting and it just gets lost in how we see the present.
Yeah. You were asking why, as a cis person, I'm doing this series. And part of it is I think that a lot of other cis people would be interested in hearing those stories.
I am interested.
Right. And I think it would be a good way to get people talking about what our culture really was like and what has been imported into our culture as our culture, right? Because what happened was in China, for example, there was the Opium Wars, right? China lost. And there was deep shame that came with that. And at the same time, Japan saw what was happening and they're like, if China lost, we're screwed. We're tiny compared to China. So they were also, we got to catch up with these guys. We got to do what they're doing. And then when the British colonized a bunch of countries in Asia, like India and a bunch of other places, their laws were imposed in those countries. And in their constitution at the time, there was a law against sodomy. So a lot of the Asian countries that were British colonies, not just Asian, like any country that was a British colony, if they have a law against homosexuality, it's usually something that's a remnant of British colonization. So all the Europeans, they get to Asia and they see, emperors having sex with men. They're like, oh my God, their mind is blown and they're like horrified. All the missionaries are horrified. We got to educate these people, right? So they come in, they implement their laws. And now 100 years later or several hundred years later, they turn around and say, we have gay rights. You're backwards. I'm like, excuse me, you brought this here.
I could have another full episode with you because I have so many questions about your music. I have questions about things that you've said. Maybe we should do it.
Right?
There are so many fascinating conversations that we could have. Lazou, in the end, if you were to define the United States of America in a word or a sentence, how would you do that?
Ooh, a contradiction.
I like that. I think another guest said the same thing, and that's so on point.
Yeah.
I love it. So where can people find your podcast, information about the work that you're doing, your music?
You can find the podcast anywhere on podcast platforms or go to nuancespod.com. And for my music, I think there is a link on the podcast website where you go to the About page. There is a link to my music there, so you can check that out.
Thank you so much. This was so good.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
So, what did you think? I'm sure you loved it, right? Now, guys, I am so proud of the work that we are doing at Immigrant Lee by creating these incredible stories and having these important conversations. And these conversations are not just limited to Immigrant Lee, right? We have Invisible Hate, Banterly, Nationally. We are launching Sportly. So if you really, truly, absolutely believe in our work, subscribe to us. If not on Patreon, go to Apple Podcasts, where we have a subscription channel where you can listen to ad-free content for only $3.99 a month. And here's the thing. The first 10 people to subscribe to our channel will automatically be entered to win a gift card from us. So think about it. You're getting ad-free content, you're listening to incredible stories and supporting an amazing company. This episode was produced by me, Sadia Khan, written by Adiba Hussain and me. The editorial review was done by Shay Yu. Our sound designer and engineer is Hazik Ahmed Fareed. Theme music for Immigrantly is done by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Come back next week. And don't forget to support Immigrantly.